Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Sana Rizwan and I work as a service designer for a design agency that intends to create meaningful experiences. My talk is about neoliberalism and accessibility. So diving right into it, I was recently working on a project for financial inclusion, for digital financial inclusion in particular. And the assumption that anyone had before entering into this project was that the reason why a lot of Pakistanis don't use digital banking is because they're illiterate. कि उनको पढ़ना लिखना नहीं आता तो फिर वो टेक्नोलॉजी उस तरीके की यूज़ नहीं कर सकते. But after interviewing, hundreds of customers across Pakistan, my team discovered that there was a lot more to the story, of course, and that people who were very comfortable using TikTok on their phones were still not more inclined towards using digital banking. So one of the many reasons is because most banks in Pakistan require the customer to have a debit card in order to access online banking. And this immediately adds a barrier because it means that only those people who can afford to pay the annual fee for the debit card, they get to access digital banking. And another added insight was that bank employees have very strict KPIs, sometimes to sell gold cards or platinum cards. And what that often does is that it pushes them to sign customers up for these cards at the time of account opening without their knowledge. And customers who can't afford this or realize that debit cards are very expensive, then they opt out of this service and essentially also opt out of digital banking. And what this makes us realize is that it's always an interconnected, web of issues where one cause often pushes the other. And a lot of it is rooted in the larger economic framework that perpetuates it. So in essence, neoliberalism is an economic system that is centered on profit maximization and capital accumulation. And it is a hyper-capitalist model which would encourage, for example, private ownership or private and expensive services in aspects like healthcare, education, instead of prioritizing the government providing those services for free or at subsidized, affordable rates. So this neoliberalism affects all aspects of our lives and also sometimes affects or defines what it means to be human. Human-centered design, also known as HCD, is a method of designing services or products that basically focus on the human. It's cohesive and holistic, and it deals with every stakeholder involved. And it's a process that's based on empathy. You can't do HCD without empathy. And this is where you deep dive into the desires and fears that people have and the challenges that they face. And when you're doing research, you often become embedded in the process itself, and you start to empathize with not only the customers that you interview, but every stakeholder involved in the process. And in centering the human, we have to ask, who then is on the periphery? कि अगर इंसान इस पूरे प्रोसेस के बीच में है, तो वो कौन सी चीज़ें हैं जो शायद उसके इर्द गिर्द हो, जो हम भूल जाते हैं कभी कभार, या जब हम अपनी सर्विस और प्रोडक्ट को डिज़ाइन कर रहे होते हैं. So for example, when we focus on the human need for transport, do we prioritize that need over the entire planet? Do we burn fuel until there is severe global warming? And when we dismiss the ecological and the natural, do we sometimes also dismiss the other humans? A closer look at HCD will reveal that when we say human-centered design, we really mean human-centered. It's human above everything else. So we need to ask more questions then. When there are so many different types of people involved, because when you're doing research in one service alone, you'll discover that there are so many stakeholders involved. You have to understand when there's so many people, who do we choose to design our services for? Can we choose to design for everybody? And if yes, that's interesting, but usually it's not that case. You end up prioritizing somebody. And if you do, the question then is, who do you prioritize? And what kind of human do you end up choosing over another kind of human? Due to neoliberalism's very invasive nature, human beings are generally reduced to the economic function. जो पैसा बनाता है, आप फिर उसी के लिए बना रहे होते हैं अपनी service भी. Neoliberalism therefore reduces what it actually means to be human, and it divides people across a spectrum of power. So my essential argument is that HCD operates in the larger economic framework, and then it not only defines what it means to be human, but it also chooses who gets to be the human in the center of all of this research, of all of this product development, and what is actually applied And I don't mean to make this into a philosophical conversation where I trigger your existential dread, but we have to ask then, when we talk about human-centered design, what essentially means to be human. कि इंसान कौन है and इंसान क्या है? क्या इंसान वो है जो labor or profit generate करता है? And is that essentially what defines us, or is there more embedded into who we are and where we come from? Human beings just don't exist in a vacuum, and they always exist in a context. Our life experiences are defined by race, our class, our gender, and even the access that we have to all of the facilities around us. And when you think about a person, you just cannot isolate them from their context, because their context will define so much of what their life actually looks like. So when we design for humans, do we recognize their context? And when we design a product and when we create our personas, are these contexts and personas that we create, are they reflexive? Do they reflect really what these backgrounds and contexts are? And remember कि design thinking के अंदर silos में काम करना या सोचना एक गुनाह होता है. So how do we then move forward with encompassing a lot more that involves in a person? And when it comes to HCD research, there's some terms that we use, and some of the other things that we also call humans. We call them users and resources and stakeholders, and this language is sometimes very clinical. And what I've especially noticed is that, and this is where the topic came to, right? That when we think about all of the stakeholders involved in a good or service, we as designers and researchers focus so much on the customer, and that sometimes we neglect all of the other people involved in creating the service. For example, sometimes the service providers, the lower level branch employees, or the janitorial staff, or other people that we just don't end up, including in our conversation for what it means to be human. So is human-centered design essentially customer-centered design? And an example is where my team and we're working on a healthcare facility, right, currently. And it takes effort for us to say patient journey or human journey as opposed to customer journey. Because for once, this is a person who is vulnerable in society and we're designing for them. So how do we even first consider who they are? And why would we not think of people as customers? Because you do months of research and you come up with we come up with so many ideas and understandings about what really affects stakeholders, and you ideate upon solutions, but at the end, what's actually chosen is what your customer pays for, right? And what your customer is also your client or the company that's funding your research. And what the ideas that you come up with, it's usually what happens is that whatever generates most profit is chosen and implemented. So as researchers and designers, what is our role then, right? Are our clients and our companies that fund our research and also choose what will be implemented and what may not be implemented. So what do? Do we perpetuate further inequality, or do we push for accessibility and inclusion? Or do we simply just do what we're told to do? Design a great digital app, but not enough people will be able to use it because we're not actually including the ones that don't maybe generate all of the profit for this particular company. Again, the debit card requirement, what I call it. So do we beautify the interface and make it intuitive, or do we inquire further? And when we talk about smallest aspects, right? When we talk about even just interface, why do we only include two genders? And the reason I'm asking the question is because sometimes when we're looking at the heuristics of maybe a portal, we ask questions that only affect usability, but not maybe what impacts a person personally, right? So when we, like trans people who are coming to perhaps a healthcare clinic for blood tests, they now have to choose between these two options. And this won't really reflect what the normal hormone ranges are divided between men and women. And this ends up affecting their entire lives. And a really famous example that we have is how color film was developed, right? So it was developed for different skin tones, not because darker skinned people were prioritized eventually or listened to. It was because of the furniture and the chocolate industry. Their magazine spread and their advertising copy was not pretty enough, was not glamorous enough, because the camera film was not capturing the darker color. And that's how this entire product was developed further, right? This is Kodak's very famous example with the Shirley cards. So we see neoliberalism, therefore, it's not just dictating accessibility, it's also dictating progress. And HCD, one can argue, is separate from neoliberal principles, right? Because it's a collaborative approach. It actually brings more voices to the room, to the table, and it therefore creates a dialogue where you can actually engage further with different stakeholders. But apart from the co-creative session, right, from the co-creative process, how else do we invite other voices? And where do we limit them? When we prioritize on those ideas, do we actually involve the same stakeholders in the room at that point, the decisions that are implemented, especially when it comes to people who generally don't have the same amount of power? And is there really a contrast then, or does one perpetuate and further the other? And are they just, is human-centered design sometimes acting as a second face of the same coin? When you design, then you have to talk about intention and choice. And when you talk about inclusion, this will be reflected. What is your design? When you design, what design do you choose? For example, does your design perpetuate individual volunteerism over collective movements? And does our design perpetuate wicked problems? For example, right now in this situation that we're in, do we perpetuate, is our model built for individual volunteerism, where we donate for rations so that poor daily wage earners can get food? Or do we have a system where we have enough healthcare providers, where the government is a social welfare state that has enough to provide for everybody? And are these things chosen by intention, or is this just the card that we're dealt with? When after about months of research, we talk about, so this is a recent project that I was doing. And after months of research to figure out how to improve customer satisfaction, which is actually related to how the employee treats the customer, not just the service that you design in the end. The service that you design is essentially, it encompasses of this as well. And the branch employees are the front of the service, right? And when we prioritize for human-centered design, and I'm saying that we're prioritizing for customer-centered design, we forget the other stakeholders involved. And their labor is then not recognized enough. After all of this research, when we told our client that across Pakistan, one core insight is that all branch employees feel that they're not paid enough. And because they have very long hours where they're overworked, sometimes working 12 hours a day, how are they supposed to be nice to your customer? How are they supposed to go the extra mile in explaining something? Because their salary barely covers their cost of livelihood practically, and it sure doesn't cover, the emotional labor that's involved in servicing clients. So when you talk about actually creating better services, you have to include all of the humans, right? And human-centered design at this stage has to expand to cater to more people. So the company, what they did was, another insight we had was that the furniture for the cash counter is really, it's not ergonomically friendly. The service employee has to, look up at the customer for 8 hours, and that actually has it's resulted in injuries for their bodily functions. And that's the decision that the company ended up going with. That what we'll do is we'll change the furniture, but we're not really going to increase the salary because that costs us profit. And if they were to go with another way, they'd see that an overall human service was made better. So we talk about decentering design, right? Maybe there's a need to decenter design from the anthropological and look at all of the parties that are left out. And maybe designing in a way that challenges power structures like class and gender. If we were to do these things, maybe we would actually end up creating better services, products, and life experiences for all humans. And that's essentially what the framework over here has to be rearranged for, so that more people can be accommodated, and also more animals, more nature, more ecologies, because all of these things actually inevitably end up affecting the entire service we get beyond just that one product that we're pitched. All right, that's my talk.
Thank you Thank you very much, Sana, for the talk. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm just reading them from the chat window and also from. So somebody asked here, what happened to the debit card design?
Debit card design will be perpetuated because the debit card brings in the bank money. So if they were to lose the debit card, they would actually be losing profit. However, that's short-sighted, right? Because when you increase accessibility, more people are using your service, more people are actually digitally involved, and they're also more financially involved, and they will continue using your product for longer in the long term, right? So you'll actually, if you're thinking about just profit over here, you'll also generate longer profit in the longer run, as opposed to right now through the few people who can afford to use your debit card.
Okay, thank you. So first, I'd like to really appreciate that you have brought a very interesting topic, something our young designers would not go into that, the ethics, the philosophy. I was just typing in a chat that it looks like 1984 to me, and also Orwell would be very happy, you know, if he was around that we're talking about these things. And you know, so there's always this tension between ethics and the human value and who's human in the human-centered design, and how can we pay more attention to it, and then how at the same time how to balance the design requirements, the business needs, the needs of the corporate world. And there's a big debate now, you know, starting from all the way to designing for fintech to all the way up to designing weapons for mass destruction, you know. So the role of a designer has to be thought about carefully, has to be, you know, reconfigured in this new emerging framework. And I think keeping that thing in mind, Gulrez Khan had a question that you raised a very great, important point about the role of a front-end staff in providing service. Their pay is an important factor, but would paying more solve the problem? Are we then not just operating in the same framework that we are trying to avoid, to think of people in a more broad sense than just economic agents? I think it's a very interesting question raised by Gulrez.
Yes, absolutely right. And this is the question that my client at that point would also really appreciate. कि अगर हम salary बढ़ा देंगे, क्या मसले खत्म हो जाएंगे? Is that really what the end of the situation is? And of course, it's not just salary, right? But salary is a huge indicator of how life experience will be. The problem over here is not the money that somebody is paid for that one service. It's also what the entire ecosystem is and how it perpetuates the lives of all of the people involved. Money, a higher salary actually does improve life for a lot of people. But what it also, you have to look at it in a total way, right? I talked about longer hours as well. Salary was just one aspect of it. They want processes that are actually more frictionless, so that they don't have to do small things, small tasks again and repeatedly. If the bank was to remove the debit card requirement, for example, and more people were to move towards online banking, then their work hours or the amount of work that they have to do in terms of servicing facing clients over there, that also reduces. So because the entire model is centered on profit and not how all of the other aspects in a service affect someone's life, that's where everybody kind of ends up losing out. But the salary actually determines who loses out the most. Because these people who I met, right, they would talk about कि मैं 12 घंटे काम करती हूँ and I'm doing all of this so I can earn money for my family, but I don't get to spend time with my family. I spend time with other people's families. And how does that affect my life? The next day when I come to work, I'm so tired, I'm not motivated, I'm not going to smile at my customers. And when you expect me to smile, are you paying me to smile, right? Do you give me enough money so that I can maybe hire a better worker at home who can, you know, take care of my child for me, so I don't have to worry constantly about them? It's easing me altogether. So it's not a domino, but it's all interconnected. And when you have also in terms of just the design thinking process, when you have co-creative sessions, right, you call these front-end staffs who earn very little to big buildings, and they get to interact with people on the higher up level who are actually involved in making all of the decisions. And when they see how those people live their lives and how they live their lives, and when they're giving their ideas and they're saying, listen, this is most important to me, and when the other person says, okay, but 1 second, how do we, you know, think about customer over here? How do we think about the cost over here? You're actually making it like more difficult for yourself in the longer run, for them to be able to give better ideas or trust the process and trust the service altogether. So that's one thing I'd say.
Excellent, excellent points. And there are many other questions also. I have noted them down. And I think this is such an interesting a topic. We'll certainly run a podcast on that with Sana, hopefully in the future. And we'll try to answer some of those questions, or maybe also try to ask more burning questions. Shall we, as a designer, work for a company which doesn't respect all these things we ask for, and more important questions, maybe for the future, not now. But thank you very much, Sana.